Dr. Ayres' life is a portrait of a visionary leader, an innovator, and an advocate for children and families who struggle with some of the most common yet least understood developmental challenges. Through her investigation of brain and behavior relationships, Dr. Ayres developed sensory integration theory. She shed light on hidden sensory difficulties and developed innovative methods and equipment helping countless children around the world.
In the world of research, she was known as Dr. Ayres. To her students and many of her colleagues, she was Dr. Ayres. To her contemporaries, she was Jean. And to Franklin, her husband, she was Jeannie Baby. But I knew her as Jeannie. She was just the cool aunt.
Dr. Ayres was one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. Her work and her views permanently altered the way people see learning and behavior. She discovered a fundamental part of human behavior. Sensation affects everything that we do, and that when people don't process sensory information well, it interferes with everything that they do.
Her ideas were really kind of radical and in a way seem, just way outside of traditional thinking. And to see her, she seems like a very traditional person. I mean, she wouldn't be somebody that you would think would be kind of out on the edge.
She had an apartment near the SC campus, and in a big pickle jar was a human brain on her countertop. And she'd take it out and she'd hold it up and pass it around, and she explained her theory of what the brain was doing. And now people think the brain works this way. I don't think so. And then she'd veer off, and of course being 6, I'm going, but it was just fascinating. So the brain to her was like the greatest mystery, and she really did focus on trying to understand what was going on there.
Some learning and behavior disorders are the result of inefficiency of processing sensory input. If a person can't organize the input and make into something meaningful that which comes through these sensory channels, he has a hard time learning how to relate to the environment and later on to academic material.
When I first heard Dr. Ayres, I was really struck with the information because she was describing problems that nobody else had been able to explain that my brothers had. They had been put into special education, as slow learners. Our whole lives as a family were restricted. There were many places we couldn't go, things we couldn't do because my brothers couldn't cope. Now, their problems are so rampant throughout the world. Thousands and thousands of children are now labeled autistic or have an autistic spectrum disorder, and almost every one of those children has sensory integration and praxis deficits. And then when I heard her interventions, she had actually invented equipment and ways to make their problem better, so that they didn't have to have this suffering. And this is available to so many children now.
She was the most thoughtful person I've ever known. You'd ask her a question. Well, how was your day? How's the weather? And there'd be this pause, and she'd come out with this answer, and you'd feel so frivolous.
She was quiet, but had a very strong presence. When she walked into a room, oftentimes, people would just get quiet. She seemed to occupy a lot of energy space, although physically her body didn't occupy a lot of space.
Jean and Lorraine were colleagues together and used to eat lunch. And one day, Jean's sitting on the bench outside, has her sandwich out, and Lorraine comes hurrying up, sits beside her and says, Jean, I've just read about this French philosopher, and he has this. And Jean stopped her and said, I'm sorry, Lorraine, I have my brain perfectly configured to solve a problem. And I can't absorb any new information right now because I haven't really solved this problem, and I can't be waylaid right now. I have to stay concentrated so I can get to this answer. And Lorraine said, fine, I understand. 10 years later, Lorraine and Jean meet again, and Jean says, now about that French philosopher.
The combination of being really brilliant and insightful and having amazing observation skills. She had this really incredible kind of genius but she was also really down to earth.
We would sit on the mats up against the walls. It's raining outside, and she sort of pauses and she looks out and she says, I love these kinds of days. On days like this, my favorite thing is Franklin is sitting right next to me. There's a fire in the fireplace, and I'm reading Sarnet and Netsky's Evolution of the Nervous System.
Big neurology book, and that was just, the ultimate experience. But she was very artistic. She painted in watercolors.
She was a magnificent artist. Painting, sculpting, sewing. That truly is her hidden passion.
And then her other big passion was her husband. Just to see them together was sweet and comical at the same time, because he just had this, really outgoing personality, and she seemed so scholarly and reserved in a lot of ways, but he would really make her laugh and kind of break down a lot of those barriers.
And they were soulmates. They were always holding hands, and it was so wonderful. They were so in love.
She had a wonderful relationship with her husband, Franklin, and they loved to travel and go out into the high desert and just kind of be out in the middle of nowhere. They loved leading a solitary life together.
The Ayres family lived on a childhood farm east of Visalia where Jean, her brother, and 2 sisters were born and raised. Her grandparents were pioneers in their own right, immigrants who walked over prairies and mountains to claim fertile farmland in California. Jean's father was described by her sister Nancy as a stern man who embodied a good work ethic and who instilled in his children the principles of efficiency, economy, hard work, and responsibility for self and others. Nancy described her mother, Louise Stan, as sensitive, emotionally vulnerable, and musical. She loved beauty in all its forms, both in nature and in all of life's experiences. Perhaps this dichotomy in parenting styles contributed to Dr. Ayres' genius. She inherited the analytical and orderly mind from her father and her love of beauty and sensitivity from her mother.
I remember I asked her where she had grown up, and she was really proud to tell me the San Joaquin Valley. In fact, her family, I think, were at a certain phase, they were pioneers who came out to the West. And I think that was maybe part of her identity.
She received her bachelor's and master's in occupational therapy at the University of Southern California, and later continued to get her PhD in psychology. From 1964 to 1966, she completed postdoctoral work at the Brain Research Institute at UCLA. Dr. Ayres often spoke of the importance of doctoral and postdoctoral study in shaping her work and the way she viewed herself. She stated that she felt empowered by having a PhD, which allowed her to think and act independently as a professional.
I agree with those who would say that Jean was a wounded warrior. She observed in herself something that no one else was talking about. It used to be a rather simple world. There was the world of medicine, which is, you're sick, here's a pill. And then there's a world of psychology, which is, it's your parents' fault. And here are kids who have great brains, the brains work, and they just can't learn, or they just can't do certain physical acts. And I think Jean sensed that mental space in herself, that there was something else going on that nobody else was talking about.
When she was a child, she had some of these difficulties.
She did talk about how she struggled so much to express herself verbally.
I think that she went through some of these problems of not being understood, and maybe that influenced the way she was looking at the kids, because she understood, was more empathy from her side, probably because she went through it when she was little.
I think it gave her a lot of compassion and also really helped her to imagine perceiving the world in different ways. You know, whether she shared all the things that the children came with, I think it gave her the ability to understand that the way that one person learns something or understands or perceives could be very, very different from the next. And she had a lot of compassion and understanding.
I think she had a race with death, quite frankly, to squeeze as much out of this life, because she sensed there was this middle space, and what she was learning from the scientific side, what she was observing in children, also then what she was just feeling intuitively. You put all those pieces together, and she was starting to sense there was this middle space that needed to be figured out.
The development of Dr. Ayres' innovative and complex theory of sensory integration was made possible by her arrival on the education and healthcare scene during a time when awareness of and knowledge about brain function, learning, and behavior was expanding exponentially.
At that time, no one really thought of the human being as being directed by his nervous system. I could see that sensation had a tremendous amount to do with motor output.
In the 1950s and 1960s, therapists were typically working with people who had some sort of brain damage, physical disability, or mental illness. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a wave of interest in people who had learning problems that hadn't been identified before. And Ayres was on the front lines and the forefront of developing theories and methods that would help individuals that had these perceptual and motor disabilities.
Reading is a function of interpreting sensory input. What you see, what you hear. You have to make meaning out of it. That's sensory integration. But a lot of things have to happen in the development of the brain before you can make meaning out of it. And apparently the things that have to happen are related to the vestibular system. That's a system that's related to gravity and movement. And it's related to how we organize that input. It's related to the tactile, the touch system, how we organize the tactile input, and the input from muscles and bones. That's just the way we seem to be designed.
Mm-hmm. The therapy utilizes natural activities, which are based on the way most children normally develop the capacity to integrate their sensory input. A sensory integrative approach to treating learning and behavior disorders differs from many other procedures in that it does not teach specific skills. Rather, the objective is modification of the neurological dysfunction interfering with conventional learning or behavior.
It utilizes a natural, purposeful activity in a therapeutic manner. And since the basic principle of brain function is to organize input in order to make a purposeful adaptive response, most of the disorders that are related to the nervous system are really typical occupational therapy material. And of course that's not just all. Mm-hmm. Man is a being that occupies himself. And the brain has to function that way, and not just the brain, the rest of the body as well.
I think one of the greatest gifts that Dr. Ayres gave us is a way to measure sensory integration and praxis functions. She created a collection of many different individual tests that could help us see things that you couldn't see just by observation alone. She developed these tests one at a time in her clinic, and she was working alone. And I think that that's quite unique. Occupational therapists weren't doing this kind of work at that time. So independently, one at a time, self-funded, she created this amazing body of tests that are now the gold standard for assessing sensory integration and praxis.
As a young kid, she was just fun. She'd have these little puzzles and games and all. And Aunt Jean was coming to play with us. And what was so cool about it is we weren't competing against anybody. There was no wrong or right. And everything you did, she'd go, "Oh, that's wonderful."
Dr. Ayres said it takes real courage and a great deal of skill to foster a playful, non-threatening atmosphere in which the child assists in directing his therapy appropriately.
The bonding between her and the child was something that you could almost touch. There was something unsaid in the relationship she had with the kids that you knew it was deep.
There are just so many times I saw kids that were so difficult, therapists just were, you know, I give up, I don't know what to do. And she'd come in and hardly say anything, and the child would be doing all these things.
I'll never forget her going down the scooter board. And I remember she came out and she said, "Oh, let me show you how to do it." to this young boy who was kind of struggling at the top of the scooter board ramp. And I'm standing there just in awe, watching Jean Ayres down the ramp.
Wow, that is real fun. You go after like that.
Thank you. She was unbelievable as a therapist. Every time we get to see clips of her, you know, even having known her, worked directly with her, it's just amazing to watch her with the children. I think the most striking thing was her ability to watch them and to communicate with them with very little language. And she could watch and just make little tiny, you know, tips of a swing that would make the activity just right. The children really sensed that she understood them and that she respected them and that she had something to offer them that was going to, you know, be helpful.
It isn't so much the nature of the equipment as it is the understanding of the child's needs and his deficits that enable one then to utilize very simple equipment effectively. Therein lies the art and the skill of therapy. Therapy is more than a few pieces of equipment. It's a great deal of knowledge of what's wrong with the child and what we can do to help him.
Oh, you hurt your finger.
The empathy and understanding that Dr. Ayres demonstrated in her interactions with children were also evident in her mentorship of therapists who came from around the world to study with her.
As an instructor, she was amazing. She was a genius. Even though she was thinking like at such a high level, she was very empathetic with the students. She really was trying to figure out a way to come down to our level.
The first time I met her, she looked at me so intently and said, "How are you?" And I felt like she really understood how hard it had been to get here. And it's like in that one little question, it seemed like there was the universe of understanding of me. It was amazing.
She would videotape the students while they were giving the test. So I sit down and have all of my test material put down, and I sit down next to the child. I'm ready to start testing. I have practiced the entire week, and this has to go according to plan, so I become certified. So immediately, the minute I sit down next to him, he starts pushing me, and he doesn't want to have anything to do with me. And Dr. Ayres is behind the camera giving me instructions. I'm holding one paper with one hand, the child with the other, the foot is on something. Okay, the session ends, and abruptly, I think it took 45 minutes and she left, but she had figured out the child, of course. Now I know how she had figured him out. And I sat down and I must have been in agony. I must have shown it in my face that, oh my gosh. But what I felt, it was all at that moment, it was all about how bad did I do? How bad did I do? How bad did I do? I will never become certified if I continue getting these kids. And she sat down with me and she looked at me and she said to me, "Can you imagine how difficult it must have been for this child?" And it was like when somebody takes a picture, and switches it around. And I looked at it and I thought, she's right.
Dr. Ayres' holistic training in occupational therapy provided the tools to develop innovative interventions, while her work in psychology provided her the skills to develop assessments. This combined expertise allowed her to always consider the social and emotional impact of sensory integration on the whole family.
And I have a brother who's 8 years younger than I am, severely learning disabled. This is a kid that could not climb a tree. Very unhappy because of the psychological effects of untreated sensory integration issues. My parents tried private schools, psychologists, psychiatrists. They tried everything that was acceptable. One day, she sat down with my mom and said, "Now, Nancy, Phil has sensory integration issues." And he, within 2 years or 3 years of starting the therapy, was graduated #1 from the paramedic program in New York City, was climbing into burning buildings and saving people's lives. And Phil credits her with saving his life. But later on, she had a huge impact on my life because we used to get together every Thanksgiving on my uncle's ranch. And Jean was a keen observer of children. She couldn't stop herself even when she was supposed to be relaxing. And she observed that our older daughter displayed sensory integration issues.
Jean wrote us a letter and said, I, at the risk of being an interfering aunt, I would really like to offer some help.
In a letter to Brian and Christine, Dr. Ayres wrote, "It's important that it all be considered fun. We are trying to tap and activate the inner drive that is present in almost every child toward self-actualization. Remember that it is the effort that Shane puts forth that will facilitate her development. She must do it herself. It can't be done to her."
Shane turned from a frustrated child into a very happy, very productive person.
Dr. Ayres faced many obstacles in her work. Although she did not relish public speaking, she lectured around the country in order to fund the development of her theory, tests, and intervention. In spite of meticulous scholarship and rigorous research, she also initially faced resistance from the occupational therapy community as well as from the broader medical and educational communities. Only now is science and understanding